You don't belong here anymore." The words didn't echo, they lingered, heavy and precise, cutting through the soft violin music like a note that didn't belong in the melody. And for a moment, everything else in the grand ballroom of the Whitmore estate seemed to dim around Ethan Caldwell, as if the chandeliers themselves had chosen to look away, the golden light still warm but no longer reaching him, no longer claiming him as part of the celebration that shimmered across polished marble floors and crystal glasses filled with champagne that cost more than most people's weekly paychecks. And yet none of it touched him. Not the laughter, not the clinking glasses, not the whispered congratulations drifting through the air like confetti, because Ethan sat there alone at a table meant for two, the empty chair across from him more noticeable than any guest in the room, more honest than the smiles being exchanged nearby, his tailored suit still flawless, his posture still composed, but something in his stillness betrayed a truth he had never allowed in any boardroom. Not in front of investors, not in front of competitors, not even in front of himself, that for the first time in years, he wasn't in control of the room. He wasn't even part of it, and the realization didn't come with anger, not yet. It came with a quiet, suffocating awareness that settled in his chest like a weight he couldn't negotiate his way out of. Because this wasn't a deal, this wasn't leverage, this was something else entirely, something human, something messy. Something he had spent a lifetime avoiding while building an empire measured in billions, in square footage, in acquisitions that made headlines and erased competitors. A man who could close a $200 million deal over dinner without breaking a sweat now found himself unable to stand up from a chair that felt heavier with every passing second, as if the room itself had decided his presence was no longer required, no longer relevant, and around him, people noticed, of course. They noticed, but not in the way they would have a week ago, not with admiration or curiosity, but with that subtle shift of attention that happens when someone falls from a place of importance, when the center of gravity moves and leaves someone behind. And the whispers began, soft but sharp, just loud enough to reach him without anyone needing to say his name directly. "Isn't that him? I thought he was the one she was marrying. Guess things changed." And Ethan didn't react, not outwardly, because he had mastered that long ago. The art of stillness under pressure, the discipline of not giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing a crack. But his hand tightened slightly around the glass of bourbon in front of him, the amber liquid catching the light in a way that made it look warmer than it felt. And he exhaled slowly, measured, controlled, just like he always did, except this time. The control felt hollow, like a performance with no audience left to impress. And somewhere behind the scenes of this orchestrated perfection, moving quietly between tables with a tray balanced effortlessly in her hands, Naomi Brooks watched, not the spectacle, not the bride in her custom gown or the guests in tailored suits, but him, the man who didn't fit into the picture anymore, her eyes catching the subtle details no one else cared to see, the way his gaze lingered just a second too long on the dance floor before pulling away, the way his shoulders remained straight even as everything around him suggested he should leave, the way he sat there as if standing up would mean admitting something he wasn't ready to face. And Naomi had seen that look before, not in ballrooms like this, but in smaller, quieter places, in moments when people realized they had been erased without warning, without closure, without explanation that made sense, and she slowed her steps just slightly, the rhythm of the evening continuing around her in perfect choreography, while something else, something quieter, began to shift beneath the surface, because Ethan Caldwell wasn't just sitting alone at a wedding. He was disappearing in plain sight, and in a room filled with people who had everything. He had just lost the one thing none of them even realized they were holding on to, the simple, invisible assurance that they belonged. The music swelled just a little louder as the couple took the center of the dance floor, the bride's dress catching the light in soft waves while the guests leaned in closer, phones subtly raised, capturing a moment that would be replayed and admired long after the night ended. But Ethan did not look, not anymore, because he had already memorized enough of what he had lost, and there was no need to witness it becoming permanent. So instead, he shifted his gaze toward the far end of the room, where the tall windows reflected the entire scene. Back at him like a quiet accusation, a reminder that he was still physically present even if emotionally removed. And for a brief second, he considered leaving, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, just a simple exit, a man standing up, adjusting his jacket, and walking out into the cool evening air where no one would question him, because no one would care enough to ask. And that thought alone settled something deeper inside him, something colder, because for a man who had spent years being the center of every room, irrelevance felt heavier than rejection. And as he placed his glass down carefully, almost too carefully, like he was trying not to disturb a fragile illusion, Naomi stepped closer, her movements still quiet, still precise, but now intentional, her eyes no longer scanning the room but fixed on him, and she paused just a few feet away, close enough to notice the faint tension in his jaw, the way his fingers rested on the table like they were holding onto something invisible, something slipping, and she did not speak right away, because moments like this did not need interruption, they needed timing, and Naomi understood timing the way others understood opportunity, not rushed, not forced, just felt. And around them the room continued as if nothing had shifted, laughter rising and falling, servers weaving through guests, the soft clink of silverware blending into the music. But in that small space between them, something quieter was unfolding, something that did not belong to the spectacle, and Ethan sensed it before he saw her, a presence that did not carry judgment or curiosity, just awareness. And when he finally looked up, his eyes met hers, and for the first time that night, there was no recognition of status, no calculation, no expectation, just a simple human pause, as if the room had briefly exhaled, and Naomi offered a small, almost unnoticeable smile, not the kind designed for guests or tips, but something softer, something real, and she set the tray down on the edge of a nearby table without breaking that moment, her voice low enough that it did not travel beyond him, steady enough that it did not hesitate. "You can stay," she said quietly, and the words were simple, almost ordinary, but they landed differently because no one else had said them. No one else had given him permission to exist in a space that had already decided to move on without him, and Ethan blinked once, caught off guard not by the sentence itself, but by the intention behind it, because it did not sound like pity, it did not feel like obligation. It felt like an offering, something he had not been given in a long time, not in a world where everything came with conditions, with expectations, with leverage, and he studied her for a second longer than he intended, trying to place her, trying to understand what she wanted in return, because that was how his world worked. Every action had a cost, every kindness had a hidden clause, but Naomi did not look away, and she did not fill the silence with explanation. She simply stood there, grounded, present, as if she had already decided something he had not yet realized. And when Ethan finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, stripped of the sharp edges that usually defined it. "Why would I stay?" he asked, not defensively, not even skeptically, just honestly. And Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering him not as a billionaire, not as a guest, but as a person who had been left behind in a room full of people, and she stepped just a little closer. Enough that her words would not be lost in the music, enough that they would belong only to him. And she said, almost like a secret shared between strangers, because walking out will make them right. And something in that sentence shifted, subtle but undeniable, because it was not about the room anymore. It was not about the bride or the whispers or the empty chair. It was about him, about what he chose to believe in a moment where everything else had already been decided. And Ethan felt it, that quiet challenge, not loud, not forceful, but steady. And for the first time that night, he did not immediately look for the exit. The words lingered between them longer than either of them expected, not loud, not dramatic, but steady in a way that made them difficult to ignore. And Ethan felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of his usual composure. Not pressure, not urgency, but possibility, the kind that did not demand anything yet refused to disappear. And for a man who had built his entire life on decisive action, on knowing exactly when to move and when to walk away, this hesitation felt almost foreign, as if the rules he had relied on no longer applied in a room that had already rewritten his role without asking. And he glanced past Naomi for a brief second, toward the dance floor where the newly married couple turned slowly under the warm glow of the chandeliers, their laughter blending seamlessly into the music, effortless, untouched, and he realized then that the night was not going to pause for him. It was not going to correct itself. And whatever came next would not be handed to him the way success always had been. It would require something else, something quieter, something he had never needed before. And when he looked back at Naomi, she had not moved, not even slightly, her posture relaxed but certain, as if she had already made peace with whatever decision he was about to make. And that calm unsettled him more than any confrontation ever could, because she was not trying to convince him. She was not trying to impress him. She was simply offering him a choice without attaching herself to the outcome. And that made it real, that made it his, and Ethan let out a slow breath, one that did not carry the weight of negotiation or calculation, just a quiet release of something he had been holding on to without realizing it. And he leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers no longer gripping the edge of the table, and for the first time that evening, his voice carried something softer than control. "And if I stay," he said, his tone even but searching, "what does that change?" And Naomi's expression did not shift much, but there was a flicker of understanding in her eyes, the kind that comes from recognizing a question beneath the question, and she took a small step closer, just enough to narrow the space between them into something more personal, something that did not belong to the rest of the room, and she answered without hesitation, "It changes what you believe about yourself when this night is over." And the simplicity of it landed harder than anything else had, because it stripped away the noise, the people, the expectations, and left him with something he could not delegate, could not outsource, could not avoid. And for a moment, the room seemed to quiet around him, not literally. The music still played, the guests still laughed, but his focus shifted inward, toward a place he had not visited in years, a place where decisions were not measured in profit or loss, but in something far less tangible and far more personal. And Naomi watched him carefully, not studying him, not analyzing him, just witnessing. And that was enough, because being seen without being judged carried a kind of weight he had never accounted for. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, Ethan straightened his posture, not as a performance, not as a defense, but as a response, as if something inside him had decided to stand even before he physically moved. And he glanced once more at the empty chair across from him, the one that had defined his isolation all night. And this time it did not feel like an accusation. It felt like an invitation, an opening. And when his eyes returned to Naomi, there was a quiet shift in them, not confidence, not yet, but willingness. And she recognized it instantly, the moment someone chooses not to disappear. And without waiting for him to speak again, without giving the room time to reclaim its hold on him, Naomi leaned in slightly, her voice low, steady, and deliberate, carrying just enough warmth to anchor what she was about to say. "Then do not sit alone." And before he could question it, before he could overthink it, she reached for the chair across from him, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with quiet intention, pulling it back just enough to close the distance that had defined his night. And in that simple movement, the empty space between them disappeared, replaced by something else entirely, something that did not ask for permission from the room. And as she sat down across from him, meeting his gaze without hesitation, the world around them did not stop, but it no longer felt like it was moving. Without him either, because for the first time since he had walked into that ballroom, Ethan Caldwell was no longer alone. The moment she sat down, something subtle shifted in the air around them, not loud enough for the room to notice all at once, but enough to change the shape of how things looked from a distance. Because a man sitting alone draws questions, but a man in conversation draws assumptions, and assumptions are far kinder than truth. And Ethan felt it almost immediately, the way a nearby table stopped glancing quite so openly, the way a passing guest hesitated before whispering, recalculating what they thought they knew. And Naomi did not rush to fill the silence. She did not ask him questions or offer explanations. She simply reached for the untouched glass of water in front of him and slid it slightly closer. A small, almost ordinary gesture, but one that grounded the moment in something real, something present. And Ethan looked at the glass for a second before letting out a quiet breath that felt different from the ones before, less controlled, less guarded. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried a trace of something unfamiliar, not weakness, but honesty stripped of its usual armor. "You do this often?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers with a curiosity that had replaced the earlier distance. And Naomi's lips curved just slightly, not into a full smile, but enough to suggest she understood the question behind the words, and she shook her head gently. "No," she replied, her tone calm. "Just when it matters." And that answer lingered in a way that made him pause, because it implied something he had not considered, that this moment, this quiet intervention, had weight, had intention, and was not random. And he studied her again, more carefully this time, noticing details he had overlooked before, the steadiness in her posture, the quiet confidence that did not need validation, the way she looked at him not as a headline or a reputation, but as someone sitting across from her, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because it removed the layers he had spent years building, and for a brief second, he considered asking her why him, why now? But the question felt too heavy for the simplicity of the moment, so instead he leaned back slightly, his shoulders easing in a way they had not all night, and allowed the silence to exist without needing to control it. And across the room, the music shifted into something more upbeat, drawing more guests onto the dance floor, laughter rising again, filling the space with a kind of energy that had once felt distant to him just minutes ago, and now, sitting there with Naomi, it felt closer, not fully his, but no longer completely out of reach. And then it happened, subtle at first, a glance from a man passing by, followed by a nod, small, almost automatic, the kind people give when they recognize something familiar, and Ethan noticed it. Of course he did, because he had spent years reading rooms, understanding shifts before they became obvious, and he realized what was changing, not the room itself, but how he was being seen within it. And Naomi noticed it too, not with surprise, but with quiet certainty, as if she had expected this outcome all along, and she leaned in slightly, her voice low enough to stay between them. "They are not sure anymore," she said softly, and Ethan raised an eyebrow, a hint of his old sharpness returning. "Not sure about what?" he asked, and Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. "About whether you are the man they think you are, or the man they should be paying attention to." And the words landed with a quiet precision, not as manipulation, but as observation, and Ethan felt something shift inside him again, this time not from isolation, but from awareness, because she was right. The room had not changed, but perception had, and perception was something he understood better than anyone, and yet tonight, it had slipped away from him until she stepped in, and he let out a small, almost amused breath, shaking his head slightly, as if acknowledging something he had missed. "You just rewrote the narrative," he said, his tone lighter now, and Naomi gave a subtle shrug, her expression steady. "No," she replied. "I just gave you a different page." And that difference mattered more than he expected, because it was not about control, not about dominance. It was about presence, about choosing not to disappear when the story shifted against you. And as another guest approached their table, hesitating for just a second before offering a polite greeting to Ethan, something that had not happened all evening, Ethan responded without missing a beat, his voice composed, his posture aligned with the version of himself he knew so well. But this time, it was different, because it was not built on pressure or expectation. It was built on something quieter, something steadier, and as the guest moved on, the moment settling back into the rhythm of the night, Ethan glanced at Naomi again, this time with something closer to respect than curiosity, and for the first time since the evening began, the chair across from him no longer felt like a reminder of what he had lost, but a reflection of what he had just regained. The next shift did not come from the music or the room, but from something quieter, something that settled into Ethan's posture as he leaned slightly forward, his attention no longer drifting but anchored, and Naomi could see it in the way his eyes stayed present now, not scanning for exits, not avoiding reflections, but engaging, as if he had decided, even if only for this moment, that leaving was no longer the easiest option, and that alone changed everything, because the man who had been slowly disappearing minutes ago was now beginning to take up space again, not loudly, not forcefully, but deliberately. And across the ballroom, a few more glances turned into acknowledgments, a passing smile here, a polite nod there, small signals that the narrative had indeed shifted just enough to invite reconsideration, and Ethan noticed each one, not with the hunger he once had for recognition, but with a measured awareness, as if he were observing a system he used to control now operating without him. and yet responding to him again. And he let out a quiet breath, something closer to acceptance than relief, before turning his attention back to Naomi, who remained composed, her presence steady without ever demanding attention. And for a moment, he studied her in silence, not as a mystery to solve, but as a person who had stepped into a moment no one else had touched. And he asked, his voice calm, but carrying genuine curiosity now, "What made you decide that it mattered?" And Naomi did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting briefly toward the far end of the room where a young server adjusted a tray under pressure, then back to Ethan, as if grounding her answer in something beyond just him. And when she spoke, her tone was even, reflective, because moments like this do not announce themselves, she said. They just happen, and most people pretend not to see them. And Ethan considered that, the idea settling into his thoughts in a way that felt both simple and complex at the same time, because he had built his life on recognizing opportunities before others did. And yet this quiet unraveling of a person in plain sight, had gone unnoticed by everyone except her. And that realization carried a weight he could not ignore. And before he could respond, a woman approached their table, her smile polished, her tone light. "Ethan, it has been a while," she said, her voice carrying just enough familiarity to suggest past connections. And Ethan turned toward her smoothly, his demeanor shifting back into something recognizable, something practiced. But this time it felt different, less like a shield and more like a tool he could choose to use. And he greeted her with a measured nod, exchanging a few words that sounded effortless, natural, as if the earlier tension had never existed. And Naomi remained silent, her presence blending seamlessly into the moment, allowing him to reclaim the interaction without interruption. And as the woman moved on, Ethan glanced back at Naomi, a faint hint of appreciation now visible in his expression, not exaggerated, not spoken, but clear. And he leaned back slightly, his posture no longer guarded, his hands resting calmly on the table. And for a brief moment, the noise of the room softened again, not because it had changed, but because his relationship to it had. And he spoke again, quieter this time, almost as if he were thinking out loud. "I spent years making sure I was never in a position like this," he said, his gaze drifting toward the glass in front of him before returning to her. "And somehow, I still ended up here." And Naomi listened without interrupting, her expression steady, understanding without needing explanation, and she responded simply, "Because control does not protect you from everything." And the honesty of it landed without resistance, because it did not challenge him. It clarified something he already felt, and Ethan gave a slight nod, acknowledging it without argument. And in that moment, there was no hierarchy between them, no visible divide between a man worth billions and a woman working the floor, just two people sharing a space where truth did not need to be dressed up. And as the music shifted again, signaling the next part of the evening, Ethan glanced toward the dance floor once more, but this time, the look in his eyes was different, not avoidance, not regret, but something quieter, something closer to resolve. And when he turned back to Naomi, his voice carried a steadiness that had returned, but not in the same form as before. "You said staying changes what I believe about myself," he said, meeting her gaze directly. "What happens if I actually believe it?" And Naomi held his gaze for a second, then allowed a small, genuine smile to form, the kind that did not perform, did not hide, just existed. And she answered without hesitation, "Then this night stops being about what you lost and starts being about what you kept." And for a moment, Ethan did not respond, not because he had nothing to say, but because he finally understood what she meant. And that understanding did not come with noise or drama. It came quietly, settling into him, in a way that felt more permanent than anything the room could offer. And as another guest approached, this time with more confidence, greeting him openly, Ethan turned to respond, not as the man who had been pushed aside, but as someone who had chosen to remain. And Naomi watched, not with pride, not with expectation, but with quiet certainty, because the shift she had created was no longer hers to maintain. It belonged to him now, and he was finally ready to carry it. The rhythm of the evening continued to build, but now it no longer moved past Ethan. It moved with him, subtle but undeniable, and the difference was not in the volume of the music or the brightness of the chandeliers. It was in the way he occupied the space he had almost abandoned, his posture no longer signaling retreat, but quiet presence. And Naomi could see it in the way he responded to each interaction. Not with the sharp precision of a man defending his status, but with the calm steadiness of someone who no longer needed to prove it. And that shift did not go unnoticed, not by the guests who had begun to circle back, not by the ones who now greeted him with renewed interest, and certainly not by the people who had earlier chosen to look away, because attention, once withdrawn, has a way of returning when it senses something worth recalibrating around, and Ethan understood that. He had built entire strategies around it. But tonight, it felt different, because he had not forced it, he had not engineered it. He had simply stayed, and that choice carried more weight than any calculated move he had ever made. And as another conversation ended and the guests stepped away with a polite smile, Ethan turned back toward Naomi, his expression thoughtful, his voice quieter now, not because he needed to be heard, but because he no longer needed to fill the silence. "You knew this would happen," he said, not as an accusation, but as recognition, and Naomi tilted her head slightly, considering his words before responding. "I knew it could," she said, her tone even, "but only if you let it." And Ethan gave a small nod, absorbing that distinction, because it placed the outcome back in his hands without diminishing what she had done. And for a moment, he looked around the room again, but this time, not as someone measuring value or influence, just observing, noticing details he would have once overlooked, the way a father adjusted his tie before stepping onto the dance floor with his daughter, the way a group of friends laughed too loudly near the bar, the way the staff moved with quiet efficiency behind the scenes. And he realized something that caught him off guard, that for all the events he had attended, all the rooms he had commanded, he had rarely been present in them, truly present, and the thought lingered longer than he expected, settling into a place he could not easily dismiss. And Naomi watched him with quiet understanding, not interrupting, not guiding, just allowing the moment to unfold. And then, after a brief pause, she spoke again, her voice softer now, carrying a different kind of weight. "You were not supposed to disappear tonight," she said, and Ethan looked, meaning for everyone in the room. And in that silence, Ethan made a choice, not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate. And he turned back to Naomi, his voice steady, grounded in something that had not been there before. "Thank you," he said, not as a formality, not as politeness, but as something real, something earned. And Naomi held his gaze for a second, then gave a small nod, accepting it without making it larger than it needed to be, and she began to rise from her chair, her role in the moment quietly coming to an end. But before she could step away, Ethan spoke again, not to stop her, but to acknowledge something deeper. "You changed more than the room," he said, and Naomi paused, just slightly, before offering a final, gentle response. "No," she said, her voice calm, certain. "I just reminded you who you were before the room did." And with that, she stepped back into the flow of the evening, her presence blending once more into the movement of the staff, leaving Ethan sitting there, no longer defined by what had happened, but by what he had chosen to do in response. And as the applause filled the room once again, he remained exactly where he was, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because for the first time that night, he had decided that he did. The applause faded into a soft hum of conversation, the kind that fills a room when people begin to relax into the second half of an evening. And Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, as if he were letting the moment settle into something he could carry beyond the walls of the ballroom. And when he finally stood, the movement was unhurried, deliberate, his jacket falling naturally into place as he adjusted it, with a quiet precision that no longer felt like armor, but like familiarity. And as he stepped away from the table, something subtle followed him, not attention in the way he once commanded it, but recognition, the kind that lingers just beneath the surface. And a few guests turned as he passed, offering small nods, brief greetings, nothing exaggerated, nothing forced, but enough to signal that the room had recalibrated, and Ethan acknowledged each one with the same measured calm, his presence no longer defined by what had happened earlier, but by how he had chosen to remain. And yet, even as he moved through the crowd with a quiet confidence, his focus drifted elsewhere, not to the center of the room, not to the dance floor, but toward the edges, toward the movement of the staff, because that was where she had disappeared, seamlessly, without announcement, as if her role in the evening had never been meant to be seen. And for a moment, Ethan paused near the bar, his eyes scanning not out of urgency, but out of intention, and he spotted her near the far end of the room, balancing a tray with the same effortless control, her attention fully on the guest she served, her expression composed, unchanged, as if nothing significant had happened, and that contrast caught his attention more than anything else had, because while his entire night had shifted, hers had simply continued, uninterrupted, grounded in a rhythm that did not depend on recognition or acknowledgement. And something about that steadiness drew him in, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of something closer to respect, and he made his way toward her, not directly, not in a way that would disrupt her work, but gradually, allowing the moment to unfold naturally. And when he reached the table she was serving, he waited just long enough for her to finish, not interrupting, not asserting himself, just present. And when she finally turned, her eyes meeting his, again, there was no surprise, no shift in her expression, just a quiet acknowledgement, as if she had expected this. And Ethan offered a small nod, his voice low, steady. "I was looking for you," he said, not as a demand, but as a simple statement. And Naomi tilted her head slightly, a faint hint of curiosity in her gaze. "You found me," she replied, her tone calm, almost neutral, and Ethan allowed a brief pause, choosing his next words with a care that felt unfamiliar but necessary. "I did," and Ethan continued, his voice carrying a quiet clarity. "You did not just step in for me," he said. "You stepped in when everyone else stepped back." And the truth of it settled between them without resistance, because it was not exaggerated, it was not framed for impact, it was simply real, and Naomi's expression softened just slightly, not into a smile, but into something more reflective, and she responded in the same steady tone she had carried all night. "I stepped in because I saw you," she said. "And sometimes that is enough." And Ethan held her gaze for a second longer, absorbing the simplicity of it, the absence of expectation, and he gave a small nod, acknowledging it not with words, but with understanding. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the noise of the room continuing around them, but no longer defining the space between them. And then Ethan did something he had not done all evening, something small, almost unnoticeable to anyone else, but significant in its. Conversations grow deeper and laughter becomes less about impression and more about comfort. And Ethan found himself standing near the edge of the dance floor, not watching the couple anymore, not measuring the room, but simply existing within it, his presence no longer at odds with the space around him. And it was there, in that stillness, that something else became clear to him, something he could not ignore, because the change he felt was not temporary. It was not tied to the music or the lighting or the people. It was internal, something that had been adjusted in a way he could not easily reverse. And as he looked around, he noticed details that had once been invisible to him, not because they were hidden, but because he had never taken the time to see them. The quiet exchange between two elderly guests holding hands near the back of the room, the subtle relief on a young server's face after balancing a difficult tray, the way conversations formed and dissolved like waves, each one carrying its own story, its own meaning. And for the first time in years, Ethan was not standing above it all. He was part of it, not as the center, but as a participant, and that realization did not diminish him. It grounded him. And as he exhaled slowly, his gaze drifted once more toward the staff moving through the room. And there she was again, Naomi, not looking for him, not waiting, simply doing her job with the same quiet focus she had carried all night. And this time, he did not approach her immediately, because something in him understood that not every moment needed to be acted on. Some simply needed to be recognized, and he allowed himself to watch for a second longer, noticing the way she moved with purpose, the way she responded to each guest without losing herself in the interaction. And it struck him then, with a clarity that felt almost sudden, that her strength did not come from changing the room. It came from never letting the room change her, and that difference mattered more than anything else that had happened that night. And as the music slowed into one final sequence, signaling that the evening was drawing to a close, guests began to gather their things. Conversations wrapping up with promises to reconnect, and Ethan felt no urgency to leave, no pressure to make an exit that would be noticed, because he no longer needed the room to validate his presence. And yet, there was one thing left unfinished, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, and this time, when he walked toward Naomi, his steps were steady, intentional, not seeking, not searching, just moving toward a moment he had already decided to acknowledge. And when he reached her, she was placing a tray down at a service station, her attention momentarily free, and she looked up, meeting his gaze with the same calm awareness, and Ethan spoke, his voice quieter than before, but carrying a weight that did not need volume. "I spent years thinking power meant never needing anyone," he said, his eyes steady. "And tonight proved that wrong." And Naomi listened, not interrupting, not softening his words, just receiving them as they were. And he continued, "What you did, it was not about the room. It was not about how people saw me. It was about something I forgot to see in myself." And for a moment, the noise of the room faded again, not because it had stopped, but because the truth in his words created a space of its own. And Naomi gave a small nod, her expression thoughtful, but not surprised, as if she had understood this outcome long before he did. And she responded simply, "People do not lose who they are all at once," she said. "They just stop recognizing it." And the clarity of it settled in him in a way that felt final, not as an ending, but as a realization that would stay with him long after the night ended. And Ethan allowed a faint smile to form, not the practiced kind, not the one used in meetings or interviews, but something genuine, something unguarded, and he nodded once, not as agreement, but as acceptance. And as the last of the guests began to exit, the room slowly emptying of its earlier intensity, Ethan stepped back slightly, not to leave, but to give the moment its space. And Naomi returned to her work without hesitation, her role continuing beyond the significance of what had already passed. And as Ethan turned toward the exit, the cool night air waiting just beyond the doors, he did not carry the weight he had walked in with. He carried something else entirely, something quieter, something steadier, something that did not need to be seen to exist. And as he stepped outside, the sounds of the evening fading behind him, one thought remained, clear and undeniable, that the most important shift of the night had not happened in the room. It had happened within him, and it had started with a voice that did not demand attention, but changed everything the moment he chose to listen. The night air was cooler than he expected, carrying a quiet stillness that felt almost unfamiliar after the layered sounds of the ballroom. And Ethan paused just outside the entrance, not rushing toward his car, not reaching for his phone, just standing there for a moment as if the world had finally slowed down enough for him to catch up with it. And behind him, the soft echo of music and laughter slipped through the closing doors, fading with each passing second until it became nothing more than a distant memory. And for the first time that evening, he did not feel the need to go back, not to prove anything, not to reclaim anything, because whatever he had needed from that room, he had already taken with him. And it was not recognition, it was not validation, it was something far less visible and far more permanent. And he let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing in a way that did not require effort, as if something he had been carrying for years had quietly set itself down, without asking for permission. And he looked up briefly at the sky, the faint glow of city lights softening the stars, and he realized that for all the nights he had spent closing deals and commanding rooms, he had rarely allowed himself to simply stand still, to exist without purpose, without expectation. And the thought lingered just long enough to settle into something he could not ignore, because it was not just about the night. It was about the pattern he had lived in, the one that had taught him to measure everything except the things that mattered most. And as he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen lit up with notifications, missed calls, messages waiting to be answered, the familiar rhythm of a life that never paused. And for a second, his thumb hovered over the screen, ready to re-enter that world, to resume the version of himself that had always been expected. And then he stopped, not dramatically, not with resistance, just a quiet decision. And he slipped the phone back into his pocket without unlocking it, because for once, nothing on that screen felt more important than what had just shifted. Inside him, and across the street, a car pulled up slowly, headlights cutting through the dim light, waiting for him. And he took a step forward, then paused again, something unfinished still lingering at the edge of his thoughts. Not regret, not doubt, but recognition. And he turned slightly, looking back toward the entrance he had just left, knowing she was still inside, moving through the final moments of a night that would not mean the same to anyone else as it did to him. And he did not go back in, because he understood something now that he had not before, that not every moment needs to be extended to be meaningful. Some are meant to remain exactly as they are, complete in their simplicity, and instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small card, blank on one side. And with a pen he carried more out of habit than necessity, he wrote something quickly, not a number, not a title, just a single line. And he handed it to the valet as he approached, his voice calm. Steady. Give this to one of the servers inside, he said, not specifying, not needing to, because something told him it would find its way to her. And as the valet nodded, slightly surprised but professional, Ethan stepped into the car, the door closing softly behind him. And as the vehicle pulled away, the estate growing smaller in the distance, he leaned back against the seat, his gaze unfocused but clear. And for the first time in a long time, his thoughts were not racing toward the next deal, the next move, the next victory. They were quiet, centered around a single realization that refused to fade. That power had never been the ability to control a room. It had been the ability to remain whole when the room turned away, and somewhere inside, Naomi would eventually receive that card. A simple piece of paper with a sentence written in steady handwriting, not elaborate, not performative, just honest. You did not just help me stay, you reminded me why I should. And she would read it the same way she had spoken all night, without surprise, without expectation, just understanding. Because she had never stepped in for recognition, she had stepped in because she saw what others chose not to. And as the city lights stretched out ahead of him, Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment, not to escape, but to hold on to what he had learned, because he knew something now that he had not known before, something no success had ever taught him. That the most valuable thing in any room is not the one who commands it, but the one who chooses to see others when it matters most, and that sometimes the quietest voice is the one that changes everything.